I'm present. Okay, great. So hi, everybody. I'm Kelly. I teach in the English department here at LaGuardia. And sort of, excuse me, my idea for today's talk was to give you kind of a primer on how I got into this field and what the central questions were that I was asking when I set out to write a book on video game studies, and give you a little insight into what's covered in the book, and then also some tidbits of stuff that I've worked on in the field of video game studies outside of specifically what's in the book. So it's called The Performance of Video Games, and the first thing that's probably worth noting here is that my PhD is actually in theater. I went to the City University of New York Graduate Center from 2008 to 2014. And those dates are important because at that time in the field of theater studies, I actually had to do a considerable amount of work to justify that this was something that was worth pursuing within a department that focused at that time really on theater with a kind of capital T. Now the work is a bit more theater and performance studies. So I was one of only two people at that time in the program who were even thinking through this idea of how we could use the stuff that we know from theater and performance in order to talk about video games. Where we are right now, about 10 years since I finished my PhD, the field is a lot different. There's a lot more that's happening in video game studies. And for those of you who are particularly interested in this topic, there are lots of ways in which it overlaps with other things that you might be studying. You might not even realize that this is something that you can pursue with your own graduate work or your own careers beyond your time here at LaGuardia. Ooh, that went very quickly. Okay, so as I said, right, there was a central question for me of how could we use what we know from theater and performance to talk about video games. I sort of realized very quickly while I was in graduate school that a lot of the theories we were talking about in theater actually overlapped with what the experience was of playing a video game, right? And the word play is very central to the things that I'll talk to you about today. That when we take on a role in a drama or we sit down to play a game, there is a kind of duality that exists where we are still ourselves and we are aware of ourselves, even at the same time as we take on the perspective of a particular character within the world of that fictional narrative. And at the time, I was particularly fascinated by first-person shooter style video games, because they're super fun to play. I was really into Halo when I was in graduate school. Like, I would get up like 6 o'clock in the morning so I could play 2 hours of Halo before I had to go to work or to classes because I was that into playing the game. But also because that idea of kind of molding the self into the character that happens when an actor steps into a role in a play seemed most relevant to the experience of a first-person shooter, right? If you play one of those games, you look directly through the eyes of the character you're playing as, and there's very little separation between yourself and that character, and then it's just the controller that acts as the conduit to the action. And there was a lot of scholarship at the time coming out surrounding games like Halo and talking about how folks would speak about their gaming experiences in the first person, in the same way someone who perhaps ascribes to a method style of acting where they kind of take on the character that they're playing and they play them 24/7 for the duration of taking on the role, might talk about the character they were portraying. So I realized, my hobby of playing and the work that I was doing in graduate school clearly had some sort of overlap. And the central question, right, about that notion of performance for me came back to a question about selfhood, right? How do we understand who we are? I also work in the field of gender studies. My dissertation was on queer performance. And one of the central concepts there is the idea of a kind of performativity of self, that we put on particular identities and we take those identities off, depending on the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves. And I thought that too was potentially relevant to this conversation about video games. So I tried to finesse what I was looking at, and again, in order to convince my department that this was worth studying, that there was a larger question about what it means to perform, what it means to assume an identity that was relevant to a conversation about the digital, as well as to live forms of performance. And I will just say as a sidebar, it's not in this presentation, but I did end up extending that metaphor later on and writing about our social media personas as a similar type of performance of self that exists in the digital sphere. The other thing that happened right around the same time when I was in graduate school was this kind of sea change in the way the rest of American culture and society was thinking about video games. In 2012, the Smithsonian put on what at the time was a very significant exhibition for those of us who work in video game studies, called The Art of Video Games. I made a special trip down to DC just to see it. And it raised this question at the time, well, the Smithsonian is saying that video games are art. I mean, this changes everything. It's not just pop culture. It's not just entertainment. It's not just something for kids. This is something that we need to be studying in a more significant way. And I will say here that big question that people had asked throughout my childhood in the late 80s and 90s, even maybe up until the time of this exhibition, right? Do video games make kids violent or dangerous? This was really the moment at which we started to be able to move back past that particular question. I was actually told when I proposed this as an idea, like, don't even engage that. We're beyond that as a field, as a society, and really start thinking about video games as a cultural artifact, because clearly they are very, very significant to who we are as a society and to individual people as they assert their own identities. So the first way I went about sort of justifying why I was going to work on video games from the literature was really deeply indebted to this 2011 book from Jane McGonigal, who was one of the true founders and pioneers of the field of video game studies. And she was one of those people who said, we need to toss out all of these negative stereotypes that exist about gaming, and instead think about the ways in which games can make us better. And over the course of this book, she really explores the ways in which, as she says in the quotation here, through playing games, we develop world-changing ways of thinking, organizing, and acting, and that there are actually many opportunities to use those skills for real world good, right? A kind of direct opposition to that stereotype that video games are in fact a negative force. And I just have here a couple of other examples of folks who draw attention to this positive quality of video games, right? That it's not just something that's a distraction or an escape, but in fact, Cam argues here that if you took the ideas of playing a video game and you applied that to your life, you could actually be kind of better equipped to have a more exciting life. And McGonigal reinforced that with her 2015 book, Super Better, with these rules to live by that she noted. So she wrote this book after having suffered from a traumatic injury, and she was really trying to motivate herself to get back out there and do the work. And as she started thinking about how to do that, she realized that the same set of steps that we might use to win at a video game would also be useful if we're trying to win at pretty much any task that we are doing in our day-to-day lives. And by this point, I started to feel like, okay, well, it's clear that there's a positive to video gaming. And a lot of my scholarship in this period largely relied on this argument, right? That I would go to conferences or write about the idea that, yeah, we should be talking about video games because they because they make us better, because they empower us, because they give us skills and tools that we can use in the real world. But then I started to think a bit more critically about, okay, well, why do I keep coming back to this question of why do video games matter? Like the Smithsonian exhibition at this point was over 10 years ago. Is that really still at the center of the discussion, or should it still be at the center of the discussion in video game studies? And in more recent work that I've been doing, I started to realize I don't think we need that big of a justification for video games. Why video games? Because they're fun, because they offer us pleasure, and there is inherent value in pleasure, right? When people ask what is the purpose of theater, the sort of correct answer, if you will, is theater is to educate and entertain. And in fact, even some of the theater folks like Bertolt Brecht, who we often most clearly put in the educate quality, who made plays to teach political lessons to the audiences. Even Brecht wrote at one point, but if the thing's not entertaining, right, it's not going to have any impact. So I started to really shift what I was thinking about in terms of the answer to this question, why video games, and really try to look for places where we could highlight this concept that connects the notion of play with a notion of pleasure, which I think is something, when we work in popular culture studies, there's often a feeling of like, oh, we have to justify that this is worthy of scholarship. And it's, I think this is sort of a good model for remembering, like, if it is a positive in our human experiences, it's probably worthy of our scholarship. And I know there's a lot of text on these slides. I'm happy for you folks, if you want copies of the slides, you're more than welcome to have them afterwards. I really just wanted to give you a snapshot of just how many people are working on this subject and how robust of a scholarly field it has become over the last decade plus. And in these particular instances, I pulled out for you where folks were drawing attention to some of these points that would constitute the pleasure of playing a video game. For Wardrip Fruin, in How Pac-Man Eats, he thinks about the ways in which, right, video games provide a sense of satisfaction, that we could learn something, and that they also create an emotional effect for the player as well, right? We might be thinking about the game long after we've played it. And we might feel regret, or when we do something wrong in the game, we might feel that same sense of frustration we would if we did something wrong in our daily lives. And you will notice, right, those who weren't chatting with me about my Celeste dress earlier, there's a lot of Animal Crossing in this presentation, and that is somewhat twofold in that I fell in love with Animal Crossing New Horizons like many people did 3.5 years ago, but also I will say I wrote most of the book during the time of the pandemic and the lockdown, when lots of us were playing a lot of Animal Crossing. I'm one of the holdouts who's still playing in 2023, and I play every single day, even just for a little bit. Why? Because of this pleasure that Johnny Sun draws attention to in his book of short personal essays, Goodbye Again, that there is this enjoyment, and certainly this is the case for me, as he said, simply in knowing what to do and then achieving a desired, reliable outcome in doing it, right? If we think about that game in this critical way, that's where pleasure lies. You never win at a game like Animal Crossing. You never beat a game like Animal Crossing, but clearly we as human beings must crave that sense of satisfaction of being assigned a task and of completing that task, and at times being rewarded for the successful completion of that task. And then just to give you kind of a snapshot of where my work on video games is at this particular moment, I was really inspired by this idea that Ian Bogost and others talk about that has to do with world building in video games, that there's this pleasure within the rules of a video game that create a kind of set of boundaries for what you can do within that game. And he talks about this as being a kind of magic circle, which reminded me of the idea in acting theory of the magic if, where actors sort of take on the what if quality that the play puts at them, and they imagine that reality through the performance. And that video games largely do the same thing, right? That we enjoy existing within those imagined boundaries of the game world, and we enjoy playing within those rules and roles that the game prescribes for us. And this is more on the pleasures of world building. I thought I would throw in, because quite literally right now, I'm working on a book, co-editing a book on video games and environmental humanities, where we're thinking about the ways in which what we know and learn from video games can be useful for making sense of the very significant moment we're living through in terms of ecology and environmental crisis in the 2020s. And my contribution in terms of the chapters in that book really leans on this idea of interacting with the environment, that realizing that environments have structures and that we need to respond to those structures, right? In a video game, you can't make the environment do something it isn't going to do, which could be a lesson for us in the actual environment. Why should we force the world to do things that it isn't naturally supposed to do? And then building on that concept, right, one of the pleasures in video games is the way in which we can manipulate the worlds that exist in those games, whether it's something like Minecraft, which is all about world building, or even within Minecraft, something like the many mods that people make to this game, where they manipulate the code in order to be able to play it in ways that they would prefer to the model that's built into the actual game. Clearly, there's something about our relationship to environment, our relationship to our surroundings that's compelling about video games that might have lessons to teach us about our relationship to our own physical environments in the real world. And this ultimately, as I said, just to go to the Jesper Juhl quote at the bottom of that slide, this brings us back to that concept of rules, right? That clearly we enjoy working within this prescribed set of rules. I will pass the clip. So those are the questions I'm sort of still playing with here in 2023. That book is coming out sometime next year. If you're interested, I'd be happy to share that one with you when it is available. But for the remainder of today, I thought we could fixate very specifically on the performance of video games and some of the central questions that went into that particular manuscript. So I tried to boil down what the questions were that really guided me through that particular project. And I think it really started from, as I said, this interest of video games as a form of popular culture, right? What their impact has been. And that book is very specifically about the United States, though certainly I think there are applications of the theory to take it in a global perspective, or to look at the role of video games in other cultures around the globe. And then to take that lens and use it to interrogate this question about selfhood. How do we understand ourselves through the games that we play? And this one was particularly important to me because for much of the sort of early days of my entering into the field, the number one question I would get from people would be, you play first-person shooters, but you're a girl. And I was like, this is a dumb question in like 2012, but yes, it really is. And then I would get, well, why don't you like games for girls? I was like, first of all, I'm an adult, but second off, a lot of the games made for girls, at least at that time, were kind of terrible. They weren't particularly fun, and I wasn't really going to waste my time on them. So clearly we have some strange expectations when it comes to selfhood, even with something as simple as playing a game. Who should be able to play what sorts of games? And then thinking about cultural development, I try to expand on this idea of the positive and really think about like where we are in the contemporary moment in terms of our relationship to video games. What has it meant to American culture? And then finally, right, and somewhat more abstractly, like what's the big takeaway here? What might be powerful or empowering about video games? And I will say, I'm not going to read all the text that's on here. We'll get into it a little bit later. But one of the things I was actually really pushed to include in the book that hadn't been part of my original proposed research was to think about those questions of cultural development, selfhood, and empowerment through some of the things that video gaming has inspired, like live streaming, and like a lot of the things that happen on the internet, that I will admit weren't really central to my own experience of video gaming, but it makes sense, right? We live in a moment now, I might argue, where you can't get away from video games. They're really a part of our larger cultural fabric, and we should be thinking about the ways they look outward in terms of American culture, not just how American culture has informed the games themselves. So my book has a lot of different topics in it. Again, to sort of try to boil that down into some broad categories. And if and when you ever have a copy of the book, if you're interested, I could sort of help pinpoint for you where the places are for very particular themes you might be interested in exploring for your own work. And at its simplest, I wanted to argue that for those who play video games, those experiences have impacted their understanding of who they are. And in the early chapters, I unpack that with the theories of theater and performance, looking at the role of the actor, the role of the playwright, and the role of the director in that dramatic structure and the way in which we can see each of those three things play out over the course of our playing of a game, right? Somebody scripts the game, but then the game is different depending on how I might play it versus how you might play it, which is kind of the same as somebody taking on a particular role in a play and playing it one way, and then a few years later, somebody else playing the same role and playing it quite differently. History, this was a big category for me, and this one ended up kind of getting separated out into a few different topics that I'll talk about in a moment. And this is one of the places where I would say my research maybe opens up a door for additional projects, because it turns out there are a lot of video games about historical situations and circumstances and events. And I think there is a lot more to be said in this field, especially, and we can talk about this when I get to the slide on history in a little bit, some of the subjects that feel a bit more fraught for people, where they don't necessarily feel comfortable playing about those topics. And then memory was something I was interested in, even going into the idea of maybe I'll write a book on this subject. I was working in post-humanism anyway, and I've got some information on what that is in a couple of slides. But thinking about the ways in which, if we are going to say that our self is affected by the playing of video games, what that means then in terms of how we formulate memories, or what constitutes a lived experience that we can formulate a memory about. And then, as we said, right, these questions of self, I'm thinking about the shaping of identity, trying to use that queer theory lens, and ultimately looking outward and thinking about the larger cultural circumstances that have come out of video games. So, as I said, the first of these was kind of a general understanding of the crossroads between video games and performance. I mean, these are some in real life pictures of me living out all my video game dreams in the real world, because for me, when it came down to a question about identity, I think video games offer an identity that exists well beyond the experience of singularly playing a game. Certainly there are folks who will sit down and play a video game and then forget about it and go do something else and maybe not identify with the playing of video games as part of their selfhood. But there are lots of people who think about their playing of video games as being an aspect, right, a category in the various things that they might list of who they are I even have a Christmas ornament that we bought in a store. We didn't have it made that says gamer on it, right? Because people feel that sense of affinity to the identity of being someone who plays video games. And in addition to that, right, because of that, it offers a lot of opportunities to interact with gaming culture far outside of the world of the video game, on things like midnight release parties that used to be very popular before the pandemic for video games. Here I'm dressed up as my Animal Crossing avatar, because in 2020, what other Halloween costume was there to have had? So these ways in which, right, we're continuing to shape ourselves through the experiences we have from video games. So this question about history, originally I had this as one big, broad chapter that really just tried to identify the ways in which video games represent historical events. What I started to realize is within that, this category of the first-person shooter, like realistic combat game, probably deserved study in and of itself. Obviously, Call of Duty alone on that series could probably justify an entire book. And when we think about sort of the significance of the first-person shooter as a type of game, the original Call of Duty was really groundbreaking in the 21st century for the way in which it presented the events of the Second World War. So I had to take that content and separate it out into its own chapter. A couple of the other games, and there were many other games covered here as well. Red Dead Redemption comes to mind as one of the ones I talked about in the history chapter. So these were used really to think about the ways in which video games let people play within historic scenarios. Ghost of Tsushima, for example, is a really, really fascinating game. Anybody play this one? It's a really interesting game because on the one hand, it was kind of celebrated for capturing an historical event that hadn't otherwise been presented in video games taking place in 13th century Japan. But on the flip side of that, it's really more an homage to samurai films of the 28th century than it has anything to do with the actual history of the historical events. There's something very complicated that's happening there in terms of playing into those popular culture tropes about history and actually being a representation of something historical. Similarly, with Assassin's Creed, I love these games because there's a way in which they're like about the most significant things you can think of in history, the Renaissance, the French Revolution, but those historical events are sort of like in the background of its wild story of the things it has going on. So the ways in which, right, we might imagine stories within history stories, and I think that I think those games do a really, really superb job of sort of throwing into relief this idea, right, of potential alternative narratives for history. And then in the case of the more realistic wartime shooter type of games, I mean, this raised all sorts of interesting questions for me. And I spent a lot of years just going to conferences with papers about various incarnations of the Call of Duty Modern Warfare types of games, because there were just so many questions and controversies that came up surrounding these games. One of the first projects I did was about the Modern Warfare game that had the no Russian level, which was an optional mission that you could play, which was extraordinarily distressing because you had to be like a double agent. So you were going to have to ostensibly kill innocents in order to quote unquote beat the level, because of the point of view that it offers Russians, that the game was banned in that country. Very, very controversial piece of video game culture. Another that I talked about in that chapter is the more recent Call of Duty World War II, which was the first World War II video game to at least make an attempt at mention of the Holocaust, which again raises questions of, does that belong in a video game? Is that something we can play at or with, even though it's not depicted in the game, it is mentioned in the game. And then perhaps remaining controversial for Call of Duty was the proposed and then canceled title of Call of Duty Vietnam, that there was still discomfort even 50 years or so since the time of that conflict, of being able to make a game about that conflict, because clearly American culture has not settled its own feelings about that particular event. And this then raised the question for me, right, about comparing with theater and performance. Well, but wait a minute, we make these things we call plays about all sorts of really serious subjects. There are plenty of plays that deal with the horrors of the First and Second World War. Moments of great strife and conflict and trauma and suffering have often led to some of the most expressive plays in history. And it was particularly compelling for me, as I said, the dates are important, I suppose, of when I was in graduate school, because that was that time of Iraq and Afghanistan really being in the center of American cultural consciousness and what was going to happen in those two countries. And there was a play, like an interactive performance, that I went to go participate in the fall of 2009, called Surrender, that was celebrated for the ways in which it allowed the audience members to actually experience what it would be like to be a soldier participating in the war on terror. You had to actually suit up in the uniform, you had to carry a model of a rifle, and you had to go through training exercises. I almost had an absolute panic attack. The person running it like had to come over to me specifically and be like, just remember, it's just a play, because I was undone by this. And then you had to go through this like installation and clear the rooms, and I was like, why am I doing this? It was horrifying, it was terrifying, but it had a purpose. It was trying to show me, who was never going to go participate in this international conflict, a sliver of a taste of what that might feel like. And right around the same time, a group of combat veterans partnered up with a video game production company to try and put together a video game with a very similar intention called 6 Days in Fallujah. And it made it fairly far through production before pretty much everybody said, you can't make this video game, you can't make this a thing for people to play. Just this past, within the past year, I heard rumblings that this game was coming back, that they were still trying to produce this particular game, and they were still coming up against a lot of resistance to the existence of that game. Now, I will just say as a sidebar about that very particular game, some of the controversy surrounding it does have to do with the fact it is potentially demonizing some of the Afghani and Iraqi people that would be depicted. I haven't played the game or seen footage of it, so I don't know if that aspect of the criticism is true. But the original set of criticism was solely based on the idea, you can't make this a game, you can't ask people to play at it. So like I said, I think this question regarding video games and historical events, I think this is absolutely offering a lot of potential for there to be more scholarly engagement, more scholarly criticism. And I'd love to see people like, as I said, like I'm from theater, that's where my training is, like people trained as historians, really getting in to these materials and thinking about them as cultural artifacts of historical events that they represent. So there was a lot of overlap. I won't belabor it, but if you know the Assassin's Creed games and we're talking about brains and memory and stuff, there's an awful lot of overlap that exists between those sections and this work on memory. How I tried to separate it out was putting in the memory category games that were not about a very particular historical event that had occurred. I know Metal Gear, there's a bit of a gray area because it's kind of an alternative history of what could have happened following the events of the First World War, but generally the Phantom Pain is largely ahistorical in its content. And then in the case of Halo Reach. This is a game in the Halo series that came after, I believe it was after 1, 2, and 3 had been released, but it actually takes place narratively before the events of the first game. It's probably my favorite in the Halo series, and probably also my top 5 favorite games of all time. And one of the things that I find super fascinating about it is a game you know you're going to lose. The tagline for it was "Remember Reach," right? We were being asked to do some sort of active collective memory about an imagined historical event, as opposed to trying to, in the case of like Halo 3, finish the fight, right? Do something that is actively going to change the outcome. And this was also my opportunity to play around with some of that post-human stuff that I was interested in. I really am interested in robots. I know robots maybe are not having their best moments because of all the criticisms of AI, but like I love the meeting owl. It's so cool, and it sort of looks like an owl. Robots are awesome. So this was also my opportunity to interrogate the use of android, cyborg, and robot characters in video games, and I thought the gap in Mass Effect were particularly compelling because Legion starts out as being something that was created to serve the species that made it, that ultimately then sort of emerges over the course of the narrative as seemingly human. I don't know, spoilers, I don't know, it's an old game, but when Legion meets their demise, the sense of mourning that can happen for a technological entity, I thought connected to these concepts of memory. And again, I was looking at this through this particular lens of post-humanism. And post-humanism, I will say, in 2023, very complicated theoretical term. There's been lots of writing unpacking what post-humanism is and exactly how it functions. For me, the easiest way for us to think about this is that generally, right, in a humanist perspective, human beings are special. We, because of our consciousness, we are something separate from anything else. And post-humanism says that's not actually the case, that humanity is part of a much more complicated system, and therefore, right, we could easily have something that exists beyond or after this, great triumph that is the human being. And if we think about it, right, we, as Anne Catherine Hale says in her book, How We Became Post-Human, we are, in a sense, already post-human. For me to be able to give you this talk, right? I have a clicker in my hand, I have slides to support me, I'm being shown on a camera. Even something as simple as the fact that I am wearing glasses in order to see could suggest that we are post-human, that this human body is not enough. So we've invented tools to expand what the human body is capable of. And for me, this is my perspective on the video gaming experience, is that it is an inherently post-human experience. I'm never going to get to travel through space or fight on the battlefield or create my own island full of little magical animal creatures, but through the prosthesis of that controller, of that video game, I'm able to do those things I wouldn't otherwise have been capable of. So I'm someone who's largely convinced by the theories and concepts of post-humanism. And I will just say, because I mentioned it before, this what these conversations are right now surrounding AI. I mean, Hales was talking about this back in the 1990s. That yes, there are many pleasures that come from the idea of being post-human. We're going to make our lives so much better and so much easier through all of these technological inventions. But of course, along with that pleasure comes terror that we're going to replace ourselves, right? We're going to make the human obsolete, post signifying something that comes after. So this, for me, brought me back to the questions of Animal Crossing New Horizons. And again, as I said before, I think it being 2020, when I was doing a lot of this work, only made this more central. Obviously, there were many, many games I could have chosen to write about that include a customization feature, and even that whole idea of creating your own character, and then the sort of story and environment in which that character operates are not even unique to video games. Live action role playing, much tabletop gaming involves this same sort of mechanism. But because we were living through a time where it felt like, well, who are we and what are we supposed to be doing? This felt like a particularly compelling example of that post-human extension of self, right? I can't go anywhere, but my avatar can. And I'm certainly not unique in having written about this particular phenomenon. There were lots of articles that came out in very prestigious places like the New York Times, like Bloomberg, that reflected on exactly this reality, that there was something about the game, come on, rights, that well reflected the realities of living in and through the quarantine era of the pandemic. The Berber Jin article specifically talks about how some people got into real world stock market trading because of the turnups in Animal Crossing. I never went that far and I have no money to put in stocks anyway. So be that as it may, I'll stick to bells in the virtual world. But the story is fascinating that this young woman made a significant amount of money just using the skills she was honing in game and translating them into real world sort of practice. And I actually kind of thought about this sort of after we put this together, but if the overall book is maybe longer or less interesting to you, of my work, if you wanted to read something, this piece on Animal Crossing, Puppetry in the Age of Posthumanism, I think might be a good sort of introduction to some of the content and themes that are covered in much more depth in certain sections of the book, but really distilled to thinking about that particular moment we all lived through, this particular game that many of us played, and the ways in which it sort of reflected and encapsulated that very particular moment in history. And if anyone is interested in and can't, I don't actually know if our library has Puppetry International. If we don't and anyone wants to read it, please feel free to email me and I can send you a PDF copy of it. So then the last area that I explored, like I said, kind of on recommendation, if we're going to talk about video games and performance, then we should probably talk about their impact on the popular culture. This is somewhat of a large chapter that, again, I think could easily have been a book project, and maybe topics within it could be book projects in and of themselves. I'm thinking of many of the cultural experiences that relate to this idea, right, of gamer as an identity or as a marker of selfhood. And I overheard in your announcements, you're going to Anime Fest, right? Conventions are a central part of this experience. I'm a New York Comic-Con devotee. It is my Christmas, my high holy days, right? Those are the 4 days my year pivots entirely around. So I wrote about that way in which we want to experience these fandoms in real life, in the real world, in real time, because we want to take something of that individual virtual experience and experience it in the real world. And I think for many, we have potentially found our communities through these sorts of experiences, using virtual platforms in order to interact with one another online, and then if we're lucky enough, being able to go to these sorts of events and share space with like-minded people in real time. Cosplay, obviously, as a performance person, I couldn't ignore the popularity of dressing up in costume. I don't really do it, so I didn't have the same sort of firsthand insight as I'm sure many other folks do. Maybe some of you like to do cosplay, but it is absolutely right. If we think about the theater as being about embodiment, about putting the character on, about living life as and with the character as part of the self. I mean, it makes sense that people would want to wear these characters in this literal sort of way. And probably the most significant of these is, of course, live streaming. And once I started getting into this, which was fully for research purposes, my life is cool. Just sitting around and watching Twitch and calling it research, those were good days. I started to realize, like, this is theater in so many ways, right? They are putting on a performance of themselves, playing the particular video game, and we get to interact in certain ways as audience members, right, with the ways in which they play that game, right? We have our own commentary of don't do that, or you should do it this way, or what have you. And this, these buttons and me are not friends today. This has created this whole idea of a community that exists, even, I would argue, kind of like 1 degree back. Like, there's the playing of the games, there's the watching of the people playing the games, and now there are these communities that surround a fandom of the people who we watch playing the particular games. And this has begun, I think, to change the shape of the video game industry and the prominence, perhaps, of multiplayer, which maybe I should have said at the outset, isn't really what I do. I mostly independently game. I usually do like the story missions. I don't usually engage in multiplayer, but because of the popularity of streams, I think that there is only more and more and more demand for there to be these multiplayer environments so we can connect as community. And frankly, I think they potentially make for some of the more interesting live streamed performances. I don't think it's included anywhere in this presentation, but I did some work looking at Death Stranding and the way in which it doesn't technically have a multiplayer, but there are ways in which you can play collaboratively, and the kind of strange ways in which that very slow, somewhat cerebral game took on an interesting life in live streaming. And if you've played that game, you maybe recognize people were that interested in watching other people make deliveries. So there's, and that's also a 2020 era game. There's some interesting things to potentially explore there. And then, of course, in this realm of, right, the video games themselves as a kind of performance, the phenomenon of esports, my favorite statistic, I don't know if it's held in the years since, because I wrote a portion of it, like I said, in 2020. But in the Fortnite World Cup, the person who won, I believe, was 16 in 2019, and won more money for winning the Fortnite championship than Novak Djokovic had won for winning the US Open. And I was like, here it is, folks. We care more about video games than we do about tennis, if those statistics are what I'm seeing here. Around the world, these sorts of esports competitions, I would say, are even more popular than they are here. Yeah. This is. Do you compete?
No.
Oh.
I used to watch them.
That's awesome. And then finally, right, taking maybe even a 4th step back from the world of the games, all the things people have made on the internet that exist because of the existence of video games. So the wide range of game walkthroughs and game reviews, right? We could just sit on YouTube and watch totally in a fourth wall, to borrow a word from drama, commentaries on or playthroughs of video games where we really have no role except to watch and receive information, as we might in a fourth wall realist drama. And then people who've made their own creations based on the world of video games. And in the height of my Halo obsession, Red versus Blue was also in the height of its popularity. So I got very, very into that. I haven't watched it in many, many years, but I used to be hugely into Red versus Blue, which basically took the red and blue character models from the multiplayer in Halo and created a sort of story of what was going on with them while the Master Chief was saving the universe. And it has this real quality of a kind of absurdist drama playing out for these random soldiers who are in the background of these big cosmic events of the main narrative. So, this for me, kind of bringing it back all full circle, really returns me to this central question about the idea of play. A project I'm still in the very early days of toying with is thinking about the theories of drama, particularly Aristotle's Poetics, which is very central for those of you who may ever study dramatic literature, because it kind of defines what a tragedy is and how one is meant to play a tragedy, and thinking about the ways in which those qualities might be useful for understanding the video game. And because I'm particularly interested in these more serious subjects, if the catharsis, the way in which through the performance we purge the emotions of pity and fear, if that's valid in the theater, is there a way we could do that with video games, where we could create those sorts of cathartic experiences? And if it's not possible, why? Then where is this important place of difference between the video game and the play, right? Why can we do certain things in dramas that they say we can't do in games? So to wrap it up then, right, if that's where sort of my current thinking might be, my big argument, and I've said this throughout, even when I first pitched the book in the book proposal, I don't think this is the definitive book. I think there will be much more scholarship in this field, and I certainly hope that we will see that happen. And frankly, what my hope for the project was that by covering such a wide range of topics, there would be a lot of threads that then other folks could say, hey, I'm going to work on memory, or I'm going to take up these questions about selfhood, and really be able to start giving us a body of literature in the field that's much more precise and much more specific. And finally, right, since I'm working on something on video games and environmental humanities, thinking interdisciplinarily. Theater studies and video game studies, when I was in graduate school, two totally separate things. At this point, I don't think anyone would have thought it was strange if a graduate student now proposed something similar to the field of study that I proposed when I was in grad school. I think we need to keep pushing that, thinking about the things that you all are interested in, right, as the future scholars of the world, and the ways in which we can use video games to talk about those subjects, and the ways in which we can use those subjects to talk about video games. So you listened to me for a very long time. Thank you so much for listening. And I would want to, feel free to reach out. And I'm happy if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, so we have time for questions if you have any.
Yeah.